Welcome to another edition of Turn 6 Garage. Today we are looking at the Nissan Qashqai J11 from 2014 to 2021. Should you buy one? What is it like to drive? Is it a good car to own? Is it good value for money? And is it worth the effort finding one of these things, of which there are many of them out there? Is it worth getting your hands on one? The Qashqai was one of the world's best-selling cars throughout its lifespan, especially it was a big seller in Europe, where it was in the top 10 for quite a lot of countries, which was a first for Nissan. This car certainly was appealing to people, but that doesn't make it good. And that doesn't make it something you should necessarily want. A lot of cars can be appealing to people at the right time in the right place. So, take for example, the Morris Marina was popular once, as were other automotive lepers. Is the Qashqai really that good of a car, or is it just another one of those, it was popular new because either it was sold cheaply and on interesting finance arrangements to people, but doesn't really work as a car that you should buy second hand? Well, first things first, when you get into a Qashqai, you notice that the driving position is actually reasonably good. The seats are comfortable, the controls are well laid out, and it feels very spacious in here, both front and rear, and 6 foot fits behind 6 foot, which is really good. And the boot's actually quite reasonable, especially for its class of car. Some of these small SUVs have nothing for a boot. This actually is quite roomy, which is really good. One thing I can say though about this car is it's full of shiny plastics everywhere. It doesn't feel especially premium, especially as it's aging. I can't really say so much about the exterior styling. Yes, it's okay, but it's nothing special. You could lose it in a car park. It's pretty bland. We've seen it before, and yes, it does share a lot of resemblance with its predecessor, but we've seen it, it's a bit of a yawn to look at. Not a very stylish car. But you may be wondering, what's it like to drive? Well, not bad, surprisingly so. Having driven so many of these SUVs, many of them are terrible, frankly. Not really that nice to drive. And this is at least adequate to drive. Now, the suspension is too soft. It doesn't provide a good response going over the bumps, and doesn't like undulated surfaces too well. Although having said that, the steering's actually quite positive and quite responsive. It's actually very, very easy to maneuver. It feels very easy to drive. It's a car, you know where its front wheels are, which is a good thing. It doesn't feel like it's just, you have no idea where everything is. It's at least communicative enough to know where things are, unlike some others. But the elephant in the room here is the CVT automatic transmissions. Now, for those who've watched my videos, you know pretty well that I do not like these things. And most of them I can't stand and think that they should be thrown in the skip and replaced with a proper gearbox, not a rubber band. Yes, some of you love CVTs, but I'm not one of them. This isn't the worst one I've driven, not by a long shot. It's a lot better than its predecessors. After all, some of the previous Nissan CVTs have been pretty terrible. The Pulsar CVT, what a wonderful vehicle that was. And even the X-Trail, this car's bigger brother, dreadful is all I can say. This is at least not offensive. It doesn't sound like a strangled mule when you drive it. Amazing. It does, though, sound a bit like a donkey instead. It doesn't hold revs. It does work a bit like an automatic transmission. It doesn't really feel a CVT, which is a good thing. And having really driven this thing, it's actually not wearing to drive like so many other CVTs, which is another positive. Although if I was buying a Qashqai, I would obviously go for the 6-speed manual option, even though most people would disagree with me on that if they're in Australia. If you're abroad, I can understand why you buy a 6-speed manual Qashqai. So dynamically, it's okay. It's not brilliant, but it's not terrible. It's not going to put you off driving it. Although having said that, if this was a manual, I think it'd be a lot better. In terms of interior accommodation, it's very good, and while the build quality and some materials isn't especially brilliant, it does feel quite comfortable as a car. It's something you could get used to quite easily. It's a car that you could feel at home in very quickly, which is something that I've got to say, for a mass market car, it's pretty good. It's not something to be upset about. It's definitely a trait that I found quite surprising when I got on this thing. I actually felt like this is a decent place to be. So those things are all good, and okay, while it's a bit plasticky in some areas, it's not too bad. But what about the reliability? Well, if you buy it with this CVT gearbox, may I say one thing: change the transmission fluid the minute you buy the car. These only die because the transmissions aren't serviced. You have to service a CVT. Yes, I know, Nissan don't want you to do this, so they could get you to buy a new transmission at $5,000 a transmission. So I would say, if you buy a CVT, service it, please. You will thank me in the long run. Now, the engine itself is actually pretty strong. The MR20DD has been around for a while. The MR20 as an engine's been around since 2004, and doesn't tend to suffer from the same Nissan head gasket issues some of its predecessors did, of which the Serena with its SR20 was one of them, but not as rampant as a GA16 or a QX18, but I digress. The other things to be concerned about with this thing, well, drive shafts seem to be a common complaint. Particularly CV boots. If you're doing a roadworthy in Victoria, you really check it and you say, well, no worries about that. Electrical issues also can be a bit of a problem with these cars. And again, it's all about making sure all the systems work. Check them all off, touch all the buttons, make sure they all work, because they can be a little troublesome, these things in this area. The engine available in Australia is different to most other countries. It's just the MR20DD 2-litre 4-cylinder. There's no 1.2s available here, and the 1.3 HR13DE TT is only available in the Renault Kadjar, this car's sibling, and of course the new Qashqai, but not a J11. However, your biggest problem with the Qashqai isn't so much the car, it's the people who buy them. I've said this about the Outlander, I'm going to say it about this. This is definitely a car that was sold to people on finance who could afford the car, or barely afford the car, but certainly not afford the maintenance. The Austin Childs Nissan dealership experience when you come to see used Nissans really rings true. People who buy Nissans are on really, really bad credit. And when you see quite a lot of these things for sale, particularly when they're quite young and they're not ex-fleet rental sold, although having said that, that is something else. Ask about that question about how well maintained it really was, because it probably wasn't maintained. Ultimately, should you buy one of these cars, price-wise? Well, they range from anywhere from $10,000 up to $45,000. It covers a big range of markets and price points, depending on what you want. $10,000 is a manual base 2014 Qashqai ST with about 230,000 kilometers on it. Anywhere up to 15, you're discussing manuals and discussing cars with north of 100,000 Ks on them. They actually are reasonable value as long as you check them properly and as long as you know what needs doing on them if they have any problems. Now, given we don't have the 1.2 litre Renault engine with excessive oil consumption, these MR20 DDs are pretty good. So a car with higher mileage, as long as it's been maintained, and that's a big if with a Nissan, as long as the person who owned it looked after it, may not be such a bad car. Automatics start at $15,000. Again, high mileage 2014-15 Qashqai STs in the high 100s, low 200s, so about 180 to 220. And again, that's when I start to think maybe not for an automatic. That CVT is the question mark of all question marks at that price point. Excuse me. That CVT is a question mark, and given its age, if it hasn't been replaced, and it hasn't been maintained, it hasn't had regular fluid changes. If the CVT with 180,000 Ks has a record of regular fluid changes, I wouldn't be so concerned about that car. I'd be actually more comfortable with that than something with 80,000 with no fluid changes done. That's something you need to ask about with CVTs in these cars. Having said that, bugger all will have had their fluids changed, so you'll have to do them yourself. Once we start getting into the 20s, we start getting into much more choice in automatics. You're starting to talk about Series 2, so the original J11 Series 1s until 2016, and 17 to 19 Series 2, and then 19 to 21 is the Series 3. You're discussing more Series 2 cars, so 17, 18s around the 20 grand mark, ST about 120,000 Ks, or you can get a 16 with a 15 or a 16 with about 80 or 90 on the clock. Again, not a bad idea. Then we start to go 25 Ks when you'll see a lot of these things turn up, a lot of cars like this. So a 2019 example like this with 51,000 kilometers on the clock would be yours for about 25, 26 grand, depending on which state you live in and what is available at the time. These things do fluctuate a grand or two in terms of availability, and also if you live in somewhere like South Australia, you're going to pay more for this thing because they're more popular here. And that number is anywhere between $1,500 to $3,000 depending on the car. So the Qashqai starts going higher, and this car list price was $29,870 new with the automatic gearbox. You're looking at 2019-20 cars in the high 20s with 35,000 Ks. What they were worth new. I know a lot of those SUVs have had a massive demand, particularly the newer ones. But even so, we're getting to the point where a car was worth that new. You are paying a lot of money for it. Same could be said for the much higher end cars above $30,000, and that's when I hesitate on the Qashqai. When you start looking north of 30 grand for one of these cars, you really are hopping into a car that's a lot of money for a second-hand car, to put it mildly, considering how it drives, how it feels, its reliability. As a package, it's a lot of money. Given the fact that fleets and rental companies bought dozens of them, and the fact that Nissan was selling them at the great Nissan 1% finance to those on really bad credit, there are plenty of these things around. So you have plenty of choice of examples. So you can really pick the eyes out of the car you're looking at, especially if you are after an automatic. Shop around. There's plenty of them out there. Go and look at as many as you can. Find a good one, jump on it. But if you don't worry, there'll be another one. Plenty of them. Having driven it, I can say right now, if I was after an SUV or a daily driver for $20,000, I'd really consider a Qashqai, especially as a manual. As an auto, I wouldn't, but that's just me personally, and I'm obtuse and crazy. If you are after a mainstream automatic, then I would consider it. Just make sure you change transmission fluid. To sum up, the Qashqai is a practical, reasonable SUV that you can really get to know very well from driving it and become quite comfortable in it. And if you're after a comfortable car that can carry 5 in comfort and can carry cargo, that's fuel efficient, well, have a look at this car. It's certainly worth your time of day.